clue the hell in. You're demeaning yourself. You're less than you could be. And there's real judgment in that, and it's harsh. But with friends, it's the same thing. You want friends. They're not friends if they're not these people. You want friends who, when something good happens to you, that's good for you, right? They're happy about that. They're not like all bitter and resentful underground and like saying horrible things behind your back and telling you how they did something that was better and trying to drag you down. It's like, that's not helpful. And then when something bad happens to you and you go to them and you say, look, this terrible thing happened to me. First of all, they don't try to top it with some like horrible thing that happened to them because they don't have the patience to listen. And second, they're not secretly gloating about the fact that catastrophe finally befell you. It's like they're actually hurt by it. And that chapter is an injunction. Is like, take a look at the people that are around you. And if they're not on the side of what's good for you, then walk away. Because, well, first of all, that's best for them too. If you put up with that, all you're doing is enabling it. It's like, well, it's okay that you mistreat me in a way that's harmful to me and everyone else. It's like, actually, no, that is not okay. It's not the least bit okay. That doesn't mean you shouldn't try to help someone when they're down. That's a whole different issue. Rule 4, compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. Because if you're comparing yourself to someone else, I mean, first of all, you don't know very much about the life of the person you're comparing yourself to. You don't know it. You know it across all of its dimensions. And second, people are very different. And so comparing yourself to someone else, it's kind of useful, I guess, when you're young. But as you get older and more singular and more particular, it becomes increasingly less useful. Better to compare yourself to a previous version of yourself and work for improvement in that way. Chapter 5 is the one that I thought I would get in the most trouble for writing, I figured people would be all over me for this, and so far they haven't been, but they still might be. So, and it's called, Do Not Let Your Children Do Anything That Makes You Dislike Them. And I thought that would be contentious, first of all, because people would think, well, I never dislike my children. It's like, really? Really? You're gonna really tell me that? See, I kind of knew this. When I had my kids, I'd already undergone that to some degree and understood what it meant to be a bad person, a terrible person. And one of the things I knew was that manifested itself in families all the time. Tyrannical father, overprotective mother, more rarely overprotective mother, overprotective father, tyrannical mother. It's usually the other way around. And the terrible pathological familial drama that Freud made much of in the early 20th century. I'd seen that in many, many situations. Dismal, brutal, awful. And I've seen parents punish their children. And you can also take a page from Nietzsche if you really want to punish your children, or anyone else if you have someone you're interested in punishing, including yourself. You don't ever punish someone you really want to punish for doing something wrong, because that's actually a bit of a relief to them. That's the theme of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. The murderer gets away with it, and it's a relief to him when he gets caught. It's like, no, if you really want to punish someone, you wait till they do something good, and then you punish them. Because that'll teach them. You maximize the hurt that way. You decrease the probability that they'll ever do anything good again. And I'll tell you, man, if you want to have a good relationship with someone, that's one thing you don't do. You open your bloody eyes, and if they do something that you would like them to do again, then you tell them how much you appreciated the fact that happened, and you hope that it replicates. You see, that's if there's one thing you can take away from tonight's lecture, that's an extraordinarily useful thing to know. Watch, and when people do something that they should do more of, say, look, I saw that you did this specific thing. I saw that it took some effort. Here's what it meant. Here's how I observed it. It's like, keep that up. And man, if you love someone, you do that to them. That's encouragement. That's such a great thing.
Rule number 6, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world.
Oh, that's a rough one. That's about a mass murderer and about mass murderers.
Yeah. So I didn't get this far because, as I said, I just got this yesterday.
One, man. Well, there's plenty of things to criticize about being. It's tragic, and there's malevolence. That's basically the issue. And you can complain about that, but the thing is, if you complain about that, if you adopt that attitude, which is sort of an anti-being attitude, you go places that if you knew you were going, you probably wouldn't want to go. It's the places where, like, the kids that shot up Columbine went. Those are bad places. Like, if you read the writings of the Columbine high school kids, and you really read them, if they don't make the hair stand up in the back of your neck, you are not paying attention. Like, the one kid wrote things, I cannot believe that people could write. And I've exposed myself to a lot of crazy things that people have done and said. You just can't understand it. It's uncanny, you know. Well, that's where you end up if you get bitter. It's like, well, what can you do about that? Well, the world is harsh. It's like, should you criticize it? It's like, not until you put yourself together. You got to bring everything you can to bear on the problem before you have any right to stand in judgment about being itself. And that's what these mass murderers do. That's what they're doing. That's what they're acting out. They're saying, well, I'm looking out in the world. I don't like people. They're full of flaws. They act badly. They're a cancer on the face of the planet. It'd be better if they didn't exist at all. So I don't like being. It's too full of suffering and evil. I'm the judge of this. It's like, I'm going to make my goddamn case. I'm going to take them out. And then it's more than that. It's like, I'm going to take them out, and I'm going to do it with innocence first. Because that's the thing you got to get about the mass murderer types. Is like, they're not hunting down the guilty. That's too obvious.
Right.
They're hunting down the innocent. That's the best protest. That's why the guy shot up the elementary school in Connecticut. It's like, why do you shoot kids? Well, think about it. Well, I don't want to think about it. Well, that's for sure. You bloody well don't want to think about it. But you better think about it. It's like, well, that's where you go when you take that criticism of being approach. It's like, you don't get to do that. Not unless you want to end up there. It's bad. So what do you do instead? It's like, okay, stop doing stupid things. Stop lying. Stop making things worse. Stop making yourself weak. You know, everyone does that. They know it, you know. And I'm not saying follow the rules. I'm not saying that. I'm saying even in a day, you'll see that you have choices in front of you, and sometimes you don't know what to do. It's okay, you're ignorant. Maybe you make a mistake. Whatever. That's just ignorance. Malevolence is when you know what you shouldn't do, and you do it anyways. And people do that all the time, and that's arrogance. That's, I'll get away with it, it's okay. It's deceit, because you're lying to yourself about whether you should do this or not. You know you shouldn't. Right. You know, and then it's resentment, because, well, it's like, I'm going to do this bad thing because that'll teach the people or whatever. That'll teach God to treat me this way. It's like, that's the terrible trinity: deceit, arrogance, resentment. It's like, chase those out of your life. Rule 7 just about killed me. Like, I've had a lot of bad health in the last year, and having to rewrite Rule 7 coincided with one of those periods that lasted about a month, and it was the hardest chapter by far, and it went down the deepest by far, and it was really hard to get right. It's called Do What Is Meaningful, Not What Is Expedient, and I'll just tell you a little bit about the chapter, because I figured something out in it and then explained it, something that took me decades to figure out. So there's this idea, it's a very deep Christian idea, that the Messiah is the person who takes the world's sins upon himself, right? That's a characteristic of Christ, right? It's something, the idea is something like Christ died for your sins. It's like, what the hell does that mean exactly? You know, and partly what it means, and I would say a slightly corrupted form of Christianity, is that you just have to believe that happened and you're redeemed. It's like, well, we'll leave that aside for a second. But there's an idea there, a psychological idea. And you know that because the idea doesn't go away. It's lasted for thousands of years. It's like, well, so the idea signifies something. It has a psychological reality independent of its metaphysical reality, whatever that might be. And so I thought about that for a long time. It's like, what in the world does that possibly mean? And then I realized, and Jung knew this, Carl Jung knew this, that it was associated with this idea of the shadow. I had this client once who, her parents, man, they were pieces of work. Her parents taught her, I swear to you that this is the truth. Her parents taught her that adults were angels, literally. And when I saw her, she was about 30, and she had a lot of strange symptoms of sorts I'd never seen, psychosomatic symptoms. She had kind of like quasi-epileptic seizures at night. And No, but she stayed conscious during them. It was very difficult to understand it, and I won't walk through it. But her parents told her that adults were angels, and she was like 28. She had a university degree, and I said, well, didn't you ever wonder about that? I said, didn't you read any history? And she said, yeah, but I'd read something about the terrible things that people did to each other, and I would just compartmentalize it. And that was actually the key that I used to unlock what was wrong with her, which was eventually fixed. And I won't go into that. But I said, I gave her this book. I gave her two books. I gave her a book called The Terror That Comes in the Night, which is a book about sleep paralysis and nightmares, because I thought that was what might have been bothering her. It turned out that that wasn't it. Then I gave her this other book called Ordinary Men. And it's a great book. It's a terrible book, a terrible, dark book about this police battalion that was moved into Poland during World War II after the Nazis had marched through. And it was all made of middle-aged guys who weren't like victims of Nazi totalitarian propaganda when they were kids. They were just, bourgeois, middle-class guys, kind of like all of us, let's say. And they went to police Poland, and they were going to have to do some terrible things, essentially. But their commander told them quite forthrightly that if being involved in wartime policing was too hard on them, if they felt that it ethically violated them or psychologically violated, that they could just go back to policing in Germany. And very few of them did, partly because they didn't want to abandon their comrades, let's say. They didn't want them to have to do the dirty work, And they were normal policemen, they ended up the sorts of people who could take naked, pregnant women out into the middle of the field and shoot them in the back of the head. That's the culmination of their training. It's very interesting to read about their training, because they were absolutely sickened by what they learned to do. Like physically sickened, vomiting, shaking, traumatized, but they didn't stop. And if you want to know why, then you can read the book. And I said, look, read this book, but don't bloody well compartmentalize it. Enough of that. It's like, read it like you're one of the damn policemen, which is how you should read history. Right? You read about Nazi Germany and you think, well, I'm Oskar Schindler. I'd save the Jews. It's like, no, you wouldn't. Right? You wouldn't, because people didn't. And the probability is very high that you wouldn't. And all you have to do is think it through. Anne Frank, it's like, you're really going to put your family at risk to hide a group of another family in your attic for like multiple years while there's Nazis parading the street, and where if you get exposed, you all die. You're going to do that, are you? It's like very unlikely. And no wonder, it's not surprising that it's unlikely, but you don't want to be inflating yourself with with fictional heroism without actually knowing the facts on the ground. So I told her to read it and to understand that the policemen were her. And that's the thing to understand. Rule 8, tell the truth, or at least don't lie. Yeah, well, it's not that easy to tell the truth, because who knows about the truth, but you can learn not to say things that you know to be false. And if you stop saying things that you know to be false, then your life will improve a lot. It simplifies it. And it puts you in alignment with reality. And you should be in alignment with reality, because there's a lot more of it than there is of you. Chapter 9 is assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't. This is a chapter about conversation and about the different forms conversation takes. And it's a chapter about humility. And it's a chapter about listening. And the humility element it took me a long time to